Three Lives, Three Worlds. The Pillow Book. Upper Volume. Original work by Tangqi Gongzi. English translation, Hamster 428. English editing, rockharlequin, JoannaKuang. Chapter 1. There came one day when, standing among blooming flowers which hung over the walls like floating clouds inside the Bodhi-covered Taichan Palace, Dong Hua thought of the first time he met Fengju. At the time he didn't have any impression of her. Being the deity who stayed secluded in Taichan Palace meant he took little notice of anything beyond the changes of seasons, the rise and fall of the moon and sun, or the fortunes and mishaps of creation. Tianjun reminded him incessantly about leaving Taichan Palace for Crown Prince Yehua's bridal escort, but he wasn't particularly interested in this matter. For that reason, he didn't very well remember the maiden who came forth on Lake Wangshen's waves, or her voice that was as clear as spring showers. He also couldn't remember that pretty voice forcing itself into laughter when she turned to ask Siming, "Did that Lady Qin from Mount Zonghe really like my little uncle?" Dong Hua's true first impression of Fengju was at Yehua's wedding. The Crown Prince of Heaven was getting married. Furthermore, he was marrying the high deity Bai Qian, whom everyone respectfully called Lady. It was only natural their wedding would be different from others. Immortals on heaven were divided into 9 ranks. Not counting the heaven family members, those fortunate enough to be invited included, from the 5th rank up, a mere 10 Zhenhuangs, Zhenrens, and about 30 Lingxians. Ziking Palace was awash in light. The feast was now at its halfway mark. The incumbent Tianjun was rather pretentious. Regardless of which party, he always excused himself after 3 drinks, citing low tolerance as reason. Even his own grandson's wedding this time was no exception. On the other hand, the bridegroom Yehua had always had low tolerance. Tonight it was especially low. They had yet to reach the 3rd round when a young attendant had to support him back to Zaiwa Palace. Dong Hua, however, could see that the nearly passed-out crown prince still managed to walk with admirable balance. Soon after these two left Ziking Palace, several Zhenhuangs also looked for reasons to excuse themselves. The stiff atmosphere in the room instantly relaxed. Dong Hua Daijun turned the empty wine cup in his hand and also intended to leave so that the nervous youngsters could finally drink. Placing the cup down and rising from his seat, he saw from the hall's entrance the sudden appearance of a sumo flower pot. A white-attired maiden could vaguely be seen behind it, her head bowed as she tried to lift her skirt with one hand while she held onto the flower pot with the other. She unsteadily found her way along the columns in the corner, trying her best to maneuver between the feast tables without bringing attention to herself. Dong Hua leaned on his arm, looked for a more comfortable position, and sat back down. The dancers on stage were coming to an intermission with their performance. The maiden in white continually bumped into one person after another when at last she found an empty seat. She cautiously looked around and quickly crawled out from behind the flower pot. Taking advantage of the applauding crowd, she casually sat down and joined in with the clapping, at the same time hooking her feet behind the sumo pot to hide it under the table. She couldn't hide it, and again, she kicked. She still couldn't hide it, and yet again, she kicked. She kicked too hard on the last try and sent the hapless flower pot flying across the dancers on stage, heading straight for the same Dong Hua Daijun who hadn't gotten around to leave. The immortals exclaimed as the flower pot stopped 3 inches short from Dong Hua's forehead. Propping his cheek on one palm, Dong Hua reached his other palm out to catch the pot mid-air. He glanced his eyes in the direction of the culprit. Collectively, everyone's gaze followed in the same direction. The ruckus-causing culprit froze for a moment before nearly instantaneously turning around to a male immortal in sand-colored clothing standing beside her. She asked in a genuine yet solemn voice, "Migu, why are you such a troublemaker? How can you kick a pot at someone's head like that?" When the banquet ended, Dong Hua's steward told him the girl who was donning the white dress and hairpin was called Fengju. She was the very same young queen who inherited King Kai's throne. Crown Prince Yehua's wedding celebration lasted 7 days from start to end. In turn, 7 days later was Lord Liansong's Festival of Flowers, which only premiered once every Jiazi cycle. For this reason, many who ascended heaven for the wedding conveniently postponed their departure and stayed a while longer. Previously known for its sacred purity, Zhejiang for the time being had few peaceful places left. The Pundarika pond on the 13th sky was likely one of the last remaining. Imaginably because this pond sat next to Taichan Palace, Dong Hua's residence, not very many dared to intrude. Unfortunately, this group of not very many didn't include High Deity Bai Qian, who recently married into the Heaven family. On warm breezy April 17, Bai Qian helped her niece Fengju arrange 2 small picnics, precisely by the Pundarika waterfront. Bai Qian, in her late years, married Yehua at 140,000. She always believed her marriage came at the most opportune of times, and could not help but constantly use it as a standard to measure other people's fortunes. Yet after some consideration, she regretfully found that her niece, Fengju, was barely 30,000 years old, still too young to talk of marriage. But since it was Fengju's father, her brother Bai Yi, who asked for her help, she couldn't very well refuse. Lately, it was impossible to find a quiet place on festive Zhejiang for an intimate meeting. At the same time, she heard Dong Hua Daijun perpetually stayed inside Taichan Palace and rarely ever stepped out of his doors. A murder or arson might as well happen on his front lawn and still no one would be there to care about it. Bai Qian contemplated for half a day, and with an assured mind, finally made preparations for a small picnic by the Pundarika pond next to Taichan Palace. 2 blind dates were accordingly arranged, one after the other. Unfortunately, everyone's plan went awry today. Dong Hua Daijun not only left his palace, he left to a very nearby place. Just 50 paces away from the picnic and hidden from view by a draping weeping willow, he leisurely lay close-eyed on a bamboo chair as he fished with a sutra covering his face and his foot resting on a purple bamboo rod. Fengju had her breakfast, drank some tea, and dilly-dallied before making her way to the 13th celestial sky. White lotuses floated on the azure water, stretching to the infinite yonder. Resembling pure white clouds, they made for an exquisite embroidered scene. Awaiting at the table was a fan-waving fairy dressed in blue. When he saw her approach, he closed his fan as his eyes curved into a smile. Fengju wasn't really acquainted with this deity. She only knew that he was a young lord from a certain branch of the Heaven clan, that he had been cultivating on a certain mountain in the mortal realm, and that he was friendly and polite. His only flaw was his meticulousness. He couldn't stand ill-mannered people, nor could he stand unpunctual ones. For this reason, she deliberately came half an hour late. But now she thought to herself she should have been another half hour late, as this fastidious fairy had still waited patiently for her. Being a small meal, they didn't keep to too many formalities between each other. They sat down and started to talk. Disturbed by their pleasantries, Dong Hua lifted the book from his face and glanced across the willow shades. 50 steps away, Fengju was slightly tilting her head as she frowningly stared at the fan-shaped lacquered tray. The arrangement on the serving tray was quite crowded. On it was a wine bottle made of dongling jade along with several lavish dishes. Meals on heaven traditionally came in sets, and each person had his own tray. Although the dishes were the same, wine was prepared according to each person's taste. The blue-robed deity closed his fan and broached a topic. What a coincidence! My family has been in charge of the fairy clan's rites since ancient times. In a conversation with Lady Bai Qian, she mentioned Your Highness's understanding of etiquette has also reached the words peak of perfection hadn't rolled off his tongue when he saw that Fengju had already finished the trotters with stunning speed. She scraped the leftover sauce with her chopsticks and asked him with a hiccup, "Reached what?" The corner of her mouth was still smeared with sauce. The blue-robed deity with excellent understanding of etiquette looked at her in disbelief. Fengju took from her sleeve a small mirror. "Is there something on my face?" she mumbled and raised the mirror to her face. A pause. "Oh, there is." She emphatically wiped her mouth using her sleeve, smearing the white fabric with a patch of grease. The blue-robed deity who liked cleanliness turned slightly blue. Fengju examined herself in the mirror again and, as if nothing had happened, shoved it back into her sleeve. The mirror's wooden handle was covered in soiled fingerprints. The blue-robed deity's face turned from blue to purple. At this moment, 2 drops of sauce dripped from her chopsticks onto the marble tabletop. Fengju held the chopsticks in her mouth and used her fingernails to scrape the stain. Unable to get it clean, she proceeded to wipe it with her sleeve. This time it went away. The silk napkin in the blue-robed fairy's hand suspended in the air. They looked at each other for half a day's time. The blue-robed deity's face had turned black at this point. He hoarsely said, "Your Highness, please continue your meal. I just remembered I still have something to do. I must excuse myself first. We'll continue our conversation some other day." He left the moment he finished speaking. He walked so fast he might as well have run. Dong Hua Daijun removed the sutra from his face. He watched Fengju sadly wave goodbye while still holding onto her chopsticks. Her bright eyes shone boundless emotions, yet behind them was a secretive smile. With a soft regretful voice she said, "Farewell, don't let me wait too long," until the blue-robed fairy disappeared completely from her sight. That was when she broke out laughing and slowly produced a handkerchief to leisurely wipe her hands and sleeves. After 200 years of practice, Fengju's ability to scare other people had really reached the level of natural fluidity. The second fairy that came to meet her also came full of confidence but left utterly defeated. Only a mess of dinnerware remained on the table at this point. In less than an hour, Fengju finally felt full after finishing 2 servings of trotters. She grabbed her teacup and turned to face the Pundarika pond. She sat there to enjoy the majestic Taichan palace while waiting for her food to go down. Dong Hua caught 2 small fish. At this time, his 7,788-page-long book was also turned to the last page. Looking up, the sunlight was getting fiercer by the minute. He gathered his things and rose to go home, naturally passing the picnic on the other side of the pond. Tangqi remained holding her teacup absently like an old granny. When she heard the leisure footsteps coming nearer, she thought it was Migu, he who was even more sluggish than an aging grandpa. She broke from her trance and said, "Why have you come so soon? Did you worry I'd harass them?" She moved to another chair and mumbled, "Auntie's taste is becoming strange these days. I can't believe she picked out 2 sickly kids this time. I didn't have the heart to beat them up, so I only pulled a tiny sham to scare them away. But now I'm exhausted." She held onto her teacup for a moment. "Come and sit with me a while. It's been so long since I last watched the sun rise and set here, I kind of miss the sight." Donghua stopped at her words, and then unhurriedly sat down behind her. He chose one of the 2 teapots on the table and poured himself a cup of tea to clear his throat. Tangqi momentarily fell into silence. The white lotuses seemed to have sparked something in her mind. She turned the teacup in her palm and dazedly said, "It is said that each of the white lotuses in this Pundarika pond was created from a person's heart. Although we aren't acquainted with many mortals, Migu, tell me, do you think King T would also have his own white lotus here?" She paused and continued with skepticism, "If yes, then which one do you think he is?" Then she heaved wearily like a premature granny, "One that's just like him." Her words came equipped with a sigh as she sipped more tea. Donghua refilled his teacup without answering. Migu, as he now hazily recalled, might be the immortal who was with Tangqi that day. It seemed she had mistaken the 2 of them. As for King T, he had never heard of this name. The tree cast its shadow on the ground. Her voice was vague. "Half a month ago, Su Moi from the West Sea invited my 4th uncle out for a drink. I wheedled my uncle into bringing me along. When we passed by that place in the mortal realm," she paused for a moment, "it turned out the state of Jin had fallen 7 years after King T died." She hesitated, then added, "I knew it wouldn't last very long." She sighed again and turned around to pour herself more tea, her lips continuing to mutter, "I heard Su Moi has just come up with a new tea. What was its name?" "Ah, Floating Blue Spring. It's pretty good. Help me weave a bamboo basket. Next time when I go to the West Sea, I'll..." As she raised her head, her next words became caught in her throat. A fit of earth-shattering coughs ensued. After she was done coughing, she maintained her posture and continued to pour tea. Half a day passed by, yet she couldn't utter another word. Donghua placed his long slender fingers on the light blue porcelain cup. They glistened in the reflected sunlight on the lid. His indifferent eyes lingered on Tangqi's stained sleeves. Then they moved up to her flushed face, which was crimson from choking coughs. Her face was almost the same shade as the maple leaves. As she recovered, a smile gradually displayed on her face. It wasn't natural, but it was still a smile. She said with hollow politeness, "I didn't know you were here, Your Majesty. How careless of me. I'm Tangqi of King Kaiu, please accept my greetings." Donghua listened to her greeting and gazed up to stare at her for a while. He waited for her to finish bowing her head and sat back down before he nonchalantly asked, "Were you that surprised to see me?" Her every step was perfectly calculated. She seemed genuinely surprised as she moved her lips to offer him her distant polite smile again. "I can hardly believe I would get to see you again. Words can't describe how overjoyed I am. But you are disapproving of me. Dong Hua nodded and thought to himself that her wording was obvious. It was difficult to detect her joy within that stiff smile. Dong Hua lifted his hand and poured her another cup of tea. The two of them continued to sit there in awkward silence. Soon, Fengju finished her drink and reached out for the teapot in what seemed to be an odd pouring position. Dong Hua glanced up and saw the cup tipping more and more. As the cup became full, the hot tea spilled out and splashed all over her white skirt. That was an impression on par with a fried dumpling. Dong Hua rested his hands on the stone table, watching her intently. At first, he had only been curious when he saw her watch the sunset with such absorption. He had thought perhaps the scenery was different viewed from this spot. And since she asked him to sit down, he did. Now he suddenly felt amused when he realized she might still be putting on an act. She probably thought he was also one of her blind dates, but since she minded his background, she couldn't just shoo him away like she did the other two. That was why she cleverly resorted to this desperate measure, not hesitating to drench her own clothes so she could excuse herself. The spilled tea was still emitting steam on her skirt, showing that it was truly hot and she had put herself up to a tiring task. He leaned his cheek on his palm and wondered whether she'd try to flee. Sure enough, she offered him her trademark expression, which was a mix of regret, respect, and politeness, while masking her joy in saying goodbye. How careless of me to have spilled the tea. What a mess I am right now. I hope you'll excuse me first. I'll come and discuss religions with you on another day. The wind brought with it the perfume of white lotuses. Dong Hua raised his eyes and gave her the larger teapot as he casually said, "One teacup was nothing, you might as well use this. The tea has cooled when I last held it. Spill all of this on yourself again, that's what would be called a true mess." Fengju becomes speechless. Dong Hua Daijun had long retired to the privacy of Taichan Palace. The younger fairies didn't get to experience his venomous tongue, but the older generation could never forget it. The king wasn't much of a talker. But when he did talk, his words pierced sharp like the blade in his hand. According to legend, there once was a young ignorant lord from the demon clan who heard of Dong Hua Daijun's fame. He valiantly trespassed into Zhukongtian one year, wanting to duel with Dong Hua. But no sooner had he arrived at Taichan Palace's doors was he stopped by the guards. Dong Hua was playing chess on his own by the lotus pond at the time. The brash young lad screamed up a storm despite being pinned down in an effort to lure Dong Hua out. When Dong Hua called his guards back, he yelled even louder, saying things such as heaven was known for their honorable ways. If Dong Hua still had any honor left, he'd come out to duel with him one-on-one instead of ganging up on a loner. As Dong Hua passed by with the chess box in his hand, he backed up 2 steps and asked the young man on the ground, "What was it that you said?" The young man gritted his teeth. "Honor. I said honor." Dong Hua picked up his heels and continued to walk on. "What's that? Never heard of it." The young lad had trouble exhaling. He fainted unconscious on the spot. Fengju could only remember this anecdote 3 days later, when she was at Qingyun Palace watching her aunt discipline her son. Qingyun Palace was where Bai Qian and Yehua's beloved son resided. He was also known as the Little Doe, His Young Highness Prince Ali. In a bright yellow outfit, the young prince sat facing his mother. He sat on an adult chair, his feet dangling off the ground. He tried his best to reach his feet down, but the chair was too high while he was too short. He tried for half a day and still couldn't manage to touch his toes to the ground. He bitterly gave up and dropped his small head to listen to his mother's lecturing. Bai Qian sternly chided her son, "I heard your dad as a young boy was able to recite the great Sattva scripture, the victorious king of heaven doctrines, and the Aryakalanathi Envoy Sutra. But we must have spoiled you. You're now 500 years old, yet you can't even recite the Hulan idiophone text. All right, so it's not the end of the world, but can't you leave your parents some face?" The little doe grumbled and logically countered, "I didn't want it to be this way either. But my excellent brains were inherited from you, not from Dad." Fengju spitted tea from her mouth. Bai Qian glared at her with squinted eyes. She stifled her laugh and waved her hands in explanation. "No, it's just that my stomach has been acting up lately. You guys go on, go on." After Bai Qian's eyes returned to the little doe, for some reason, Fengju suddenly remembered the story which involved Donghua Daijun driving the young lord of the demon clan mad. She took another sip of tea and unconsciously smiled to herself. But when she gazed down at her morning clothes, her smile evaporated away. She raised her hand to brush off a loose strand of hair. The troubles in life were as countless as the hair on her head. She got lost in recalling these past 2700 years. So many things had happened. There were things she could remember, and there were things she pretended to forget. And as she pretended, some really seemed to have disappeared from her memory over time. King Kaihu wasn't exactly peaceful these past 200 years, thus there weren't many occasions when she thought of Donghua. But she was now bumping into him quite frequently on this trip to Zhejiang. He didn't seem to recognize her, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing in her eyes. She and Donghua, as the Buddhists put it, were an impossibility. But perhaps impossibility was an inaccurate term. Theirs was more of a cursed fate. The last day of Liansong's flower festival had finally arrived. As always, it was on this day when every species of flowers simultaneously bloomed in glorious colors. Even the ancient Buddhas had come to attend from the western heavens, bringing with them rare species from Lingshan. Zhejiang was taken over with festivity. From top to bottom, everyone joined in the celebration. Fengju had never been much interested in these flower and grass business. It just so happened a fairy from the mortal realm had especially presented an opera troupe for the crown prince's wedding a few days ago. At this time on the 7th level of heaven at Chengtian Terrace, Migu was preparing for an excerpt about a general and his beauty. Fengju brought with her a pouch of melon seeds and took the little doe through heaven's 7th gate to watch the play. This soft milky stepchild was her only cousin, the little doe Ali. Beyond the tall gate of the 7th sky, under the sparkling light which filtered through dense shades, the withdrawing figure of Donghua Daijun was stealing away from the flower festival's grand ceremony. In his own company, he retreated to his books and tea by the Miaohua Mirror. Miaohua Mirror was one of the sacred places on the 7th celestial heaven. It was called a mirror, but it was actually a waterfall in reality. There are billions of worlds in the great trichiliocosm. With the right ability, one could gaze into the glass to watch the rise and fall of these worlds. As such, the waterfall's mystical energy was overwhelming. There were few fairies who could withstand it. Even the ancient Zhenhuangs suffered from headaches whenever they came here. This was why for the longest time, Donghua was the only one who used this place as a resting spot. Fengju led the little doe through the gate and reminded him, "Stay on this side and don't get too close to the Miaohua mirror. Be careful not to get hurt from its energy." The little doe obediently listened and stayed away. He kicked on the small gravels as he grumbled, "Dad's a meanie. I clearly remember last night sleeping in Mom's Chongsheng Palace. But this morning, I woke up in Qingyun Palace. Dad lied to me and said I sleepwalked home." He then shrugged a helpless shrug and said, "It was obvious he had carried me back after I fell asleep so he could keep Mom to himself. So unscrupulous of him to lie to his own son." Fengju tossed some melon seeds in the air and said, "Then why didn't you run back to Chongsheng Palace and cry up a scene? That was your own mistake." The little doe jerked in surprise. "I heard only girls can cry, cause a ruckus, and hang themselves." Stuttering, he asked, "A boy can do the same?" Fengju caught the falling seeds and gave a deadpan reply, "Yes, dear boy. Our forefathers included equality in heaven's codes of law." With his cheek propped, Donghua gazed after the disappearing silhouettes of the cousins. In his hand was a book. Within the Miaohua mirror was the drastic changes of kingdoms' affairs told through battles and wars. When it completed its recount of an epic's rise and fall, the tea on the stone table was also coming to a boil. There was still a long way to go from the entrance gate to Chengtian Terrace. When they reached a rockery, the doe complained fussily and stopped to rest. As they sat down, a blinding silver light appeared from the sky. At the center of this light was a galloping horse-drawn chaise. Its wheels ran across puffs of cloud, leaving behind residual cloud masses. When the cotton-like clouds drifted away, in the air was a lingering scent of wild flowers. Such a grand display! This horse carriage must have belonged to a fairy who ascended heaven from the lower realm for the flower festival. In a flash, the carriage had disappeared. It seemed it was heading for the 8th level of heaven. Behind the rockery rang the sounds of two maidservants in gossip. "Wasn't that Princess Zhihi on the chaise, Donghua Daijun's foster sister?" said one. "What a show-off," the other unhurriedly replied. "But how fast time flies by. She's been punished to the mortal realm for 300 years now. Why was Princess Zhihi exiled? You worked on the 13th sky that year, can you tell me?" She pondered a long while and at last lowered her voice to reply. "I'm not sure myself, but that year was indeed a troubling time. They say the eldest princess of the demon clan was to be married into Taichan Palace. But because Princess Zhihi was in love with Donghua Daijun, she caused the wedding to fall through. Tianjun was furious at this news and thus relegated her to the lower realm." The first one was stunned. "What did you say? Married into Taichan Palace? To His Majesty? Why have I never heard of this rumor before? I thought the king has never bothered himself with these worldly matters." After some unhurried moments, the other replied, "This union between the demon clan and the fairy clan, that year only Lord Liansong and His Majesty were still single. These aren't our business to begin with. Moreover, Daijun hadn't ever paid much attention to anything outside of the heavenly laws. He probably didn't even know what taking a queen meant." The first one sighed, and then still not wanting to stop, led right into another topic. "Oh, I remember I once had the honor of meeting Daijun 300 years ago. He had a fiery red fox by his side. The elders from Taichan Palace said Daijun especially loved that little fox. He took it with him everywhere he went. But why did I not see a red fox at the crown prince's wedding a few days ago? After a long pause, the other side, that fairy fox was indeed Daijun's favorite. But shortly after the news of Daijun's impending wedding was announced from Taichan Palace, the fox had disappeared without a trace. Daijun sent people to look for it all over the 36 levels of heaven, but in the end, it couldn't be found. Fengju leaned against the boulder and tossed her pouch of melon seeds up and down. On her last toss, she used a bit too much strength and threw the pouch at the rockery next to the small lotus pond. The startled maids frantically rushed away. Their footsteps gradually receded, guaranteeing their distant departure. The little doe refrained himself until his face turned red. Staring at the rippling surface of the lotus pond, he wailed, "And what are we gonna eat now when we go see the play?" Fengju fixed her clothes and stood up to leave. The little doe dropped his head and sulked. "How come there was a fairy fox here but I didn't know about it?" Then he mumbled dubiously, "But where did that fox go?" Fengju stopped walking and waited for him. The first rays of the morning sun shone down on the seventh sky, spreading a golden light which gave the landscape a painted effect. Fengju covered her face from the golden sunlight and said, "Perhaps it has gone home." Then she turned and glared at the little doe. "Hey shorty, can you hurry it up?" The little doe determinedly shook his head and replied, "No, I can't." Only until Chengtian Terrace came into their sight did Fengju finally realize the aurora from the sky just now wasn't early rays beaming from the morning god's rosy clouds of dawn. She stood 100 meters away from Chengtian Terrace, stunned frozen on her feet. Very close within reach, the 100-meter-tall Chengtian Terrace made from icy marble for some reason was surrounded in a sea of fire. If Migu hadn't quickly created a force field, the fire would have consumed the singers and dancers by now. The horse chaise belonging to the fleeting glimpse of a beauty earlier was also stopped in front of the fire. Behind the raging flames suddenly reverberated a loud screeching roar. Fengju narrowed her eyes and finally saw the cause of the fire. Asian, red flame, beast was flapping its wings out of the fire sea. From its bloodthirsty mouth came shooting flames. It circled the brass bell and flew back into the sea of fire once more, aggressively attacking Migu's force field. The clear force field started to crack, giving way to the fire. The color of fear surfaced on the dancers' faces. They were likely wailing in horror, but because of the force field, no sound could be heard. Like a frozen painting, it gave birth to an eerie atmosphere. Princess Haihe's reason for returning to heaven was plainly obvious. On one hand, she would be attending Lord Liansong's flower festival. On the other hand, she could use this chance to meet up with her heart's desire, her foster brother Donghua Daijun. She must owe this opportunity of returning to Zhukongtian to high deity Bai Qian's opera-watching pastime. Knowing Bai Qian liked plays, Zhihe had handpicked and presented to Bai Qian a few of her singers and dancers. Because of this layered reason, she was able to appear as though she was here to oversee her entertainer troupe. Yet she somehow found herself in this unfortunate disaster. Someone had released the Xian beast's seal and caused the fire the moment her chariot got here. Zhihe was, in fact, a water deity. When she was still residing at Taichan Palace, she was the subordinate of the Four Seas water god, Liansong Shenjun, in charge of calling rain for the western lands. It was quite rare to come across a useful female fairy on heaven. For that reason, when she was relegated to the lower realm, she still retained her water god post. But she knew at this moment her ability to call rain was of little use. She wasn't an opponent to the beast standing before her eyes. As she thought of looking for help, the male fairy in the other force field was yelling something at her. He seemed to have a solution, and he kept yelling, but she couldn't hear a word. She was still dithering when a blur of white flashed before her eyes. In the air, a pair of white brocade slippers glided forth and billowing sleeves flapped like blooming lotus petals in the hot airstream. Ji fluttered her eyes from the slippers upward past the gossamer skirt. A startled gasp escaped her. She had seen this face somewhere before in her memory, a pair of thin cold lips, a straight tall nose, a pair of apricot-like eyes, and elegant eyebrows. In the middle of her icy pretty forehead was a phoenix flower mark. But the girl in her memory had only been a lowly maid at Taichan Palace. In those juvenile days she couldn't stop herself from being jealous of such a stunning servant. Fearing even Dong Hua would be bewitched if he saw her beauty, she did everything she could to prevent them from meeting one another. Secretly, she had given the maid many a hard time. Sometimes she had been downright cruel. She uttered dubiously. But the one standing before her spoke first. Icily, she said, as a water deity, why aren't you making rain when there's a fire? What did they make you a water deity for? Not waiting for Ji to counter, she took out the flute from her waist and turned straight into the flames. Over the years, Fengju was an expert at precisely two things. One was cooking, the other was fighting. She had lived as a recluse in King Kaihu for the past 200 years without engaging in a single brawl. It was quite a boring life. Now suddenly the Xian beast was causing trouble. It'd be a lie to say she wasn't itching for a little exercise. The white silk danced into the vast fire. The sound of her flute circled the air, calling rain to come. Her whirling lone flute tune wound around the fire straight to the sky, waking up the silver river. From the 36th level of heaven, the silver river's water flooded down. In a flash, it was pouring. Although the rain was now tempering the fire, it triggered a new furor in the Xian beast. It left its previous target, Migu's force field, and blew fire straight at Fengju. That was Fengju's lure the tiger away from its cave tactic. If not for saving Migu and the entertainers, with her personality, she'd already kill the animal with her Dozua sword. Of course her opponent was actually a strong beast, and to kill it would be a long process. But at least she wouldn't be in a stalemate like this. Fengju now felt bleak. She couldn't handle both tasks on her own. Her flute continued to summon the rain while she adroitly attacked the demon. Ji was pretty much useless. Fengju could only hope the short-legged doe could run home fast enough to find backup. As she pondered, she remained able to lucidly dodge the Xian beast's fireballs. But because she was using the bamboo flute to call rain, she couldn't cast a protective barrier around herself. From head to toe she became soaking wet. The rain continued to pour, causing the flames surrounding Chengtian Terrace to finally subside. The Xian beast single-mindedly aimed at Fengju's body, not noticing that the territory behind him was now undefended. One by one, everyone escaped. Confronting this way for half a day, Tangqi was starting to feel tired. She hadn't fought in so long, to lose the battle after only one move? She couldn't allow that to happen. How would she show her face in King Kaidu again? She thought it was time to put away the flute and use the Dozua sword. However, if she were to attack from the front, it'd most likely be able to escape. Yet if she were to attack from behind, in case it fled away, she herself wouldn't be able to dodge. What could she do now? She considered these scenarios, but before she could come up with an answer, a cold blade from behind had suddenly pierced straight ahead. The Xian beast breathed raging flames at her. She couldn't care about anything else at this point. As she was trying to escape, an unknown hand brought her away. The wind force from the moving blade gushed at her sleeves. It was so strong it seemed to have formed an invisible wall suppressing the colossal licking flames. Behind a blast of silver light, the blazing fireball was hurled back in the direction of the Xian beast. In her bewilderment, a purple robe fell over her. She struggled to crawl out from under the robe and took a look at the sword-wielding man's back. His body was draped in royal purple, his hair as white as the snow in King Kaidu. In Taichan Palace, these slender hands had held Buddhist sutras. Outside of Taichan Palace, they now held the Kanghe sword. He looked splendid no matter what he held. Chengtian Terrace was drowned in blood. It wasn't clear what Dong Hua did, but behind the silver light, the Xian beast gave out a miserable cry and fled toward the skyline. After 2 strokes, he heavily fell from the air, causing Chengtian Terrace to shake in tremors. Dong Hua sheathed his blade back into its scabbard. Not a bead of blood had touched his body. Princess Zhihe remained leaning against the chariot, her face blanched white. She wanted to come closer but ended up retreating from fear. Although they had escaped, the entertainers couldn't help but remain in shock after such a tremendous scare. Some even began to sob. Miku helped Tangqi sit down on a stone seat at the foot of Chengtian Tai. He was comforting her, but he couldn't help himself from lecturing her at the same time. How reckless of you! If His Majesty hadn't come to your rescue in time, what would have been the consequences? It doesn't matter if I died, but what would I tell your aunt if something had happened to you? Tangqi muttered, didn't everything turn out all right? Although she was very grateful toward Dong Hua, she felt that without him, her aunt and uncle would have eventually come. It wasn't that big of a deal, her life hadn't really been in danger. As she saw Dong Hua approach with his sword, she thought he was going to Princess Zhihe, so she got up and moved to the side of the table to let him by. Noticing that his robe was still on her body, Tangqi lowered her voice and whispered to Migu, "Take off your coat and let me borrow it." Migu sneezed. Glancing at the purple robe draped over her body, he asked, "Don't you already have dry clothes?" Then after searching for words, he added, "It's all in the past, isn't it? You haven't thought about it anymore for the past 200 years, why are you paying attention to trivial details today?" He then held tightly onto his own clothes, determined not to lend her any. Tangqi removed the dry robe and folded it to return to its owner. But just as she raised her head, she stepped back in alarm. Dong Hua had already come before her with the Kanghe sword in his hand. He looked at her with cold, calm eyes. Her body was soaked through. Large drops of water continuously fell down, and before long a small puddle had formed around her feet. She was extremely embarrassed. While the dripping continued, she glanced back at him and the atmosphere became rather awkward. In her heart, mixed flavors surfaced. She thought of their last encounter and became afraid. She wasn't used to this yet. She still didn't know how to treat this person. To prevent careless mistakes from happening, it was best to avoid him. Recently she even went as far as hiding from him. But she didn't understand why the more she avoided him, the more they kept seeing each other. Dong Hua gazed at her from head to toe, his eyes falling on the neatly folded purple robe in her hands. He raised his indifferent voice and asked her, "Are you not happy with my robe?" Fengju thought they were standing too close. The faint scent of white sandalwood was giving her a slight headache. She stepped back and put some distance in between them. When she was at an appropriate distance, with a stiff smile, she replied, "I wouldn't dare. But if I were to borrow your Majesty's outer robe now, I'd have to wash it and return it to you later. That means we'll have to see each other again. I mean, I'll have to disturb you again." Seeing a hard line set on his face, she paused and added, "I'm afraid to disturb your peace." Dong Hua placed the Tangqi sword on the stone table, producing a clink. Miku coughed loudly and said, "Dai Jun, don't misunderstand. Her Highness didn't mean she doesn't want to see you. You are so magnificent. She's disappointed she doesn't get to see you every day." Fengju swiftly stepped on his foot and he had no choice but to swallow back the rest of his words in pain. Dong Hua glanced at Fengju and appeared to have understood. "If that's the case, I'll give it to you as a souvenir. You don't have to give it back." Fengju's inherent stiff smile completely froze on her face. "That wasn't what I meant." Dong Hua slowly sat down. "Then wash it and give it back to me." Fengju smiled, even if her smile was as rigid as an ice block. But this ice block was starting to lose her temper. She dragged her lips to reply, "The weather is warm today, I don't really feel that cold." She then wanted to add bluntly, "I just don't want to borrow the dang robe, all right." But after weighing it in her mind, she decided it would sound too ill-mannered. She pondered on another way to put it and at last, sweetly said, "Can I not borrow this robe?" She had only spoken when a gust of wind swept over the air making her shiver in chills. Dong Hua received the tea which appeared out of nowhere from Miku and took a sip. "No." Fengju had been reigning in her temper like a block of ice, but her smile finally dropped from her face. She didn't know what else to say, and numbly asked, "Why not?" Dong Hua placed his teacup down and slightly lifted his eyes. "I saved you. Normally others would use their lives to repay such favors. How hard is it to wash one shirt?" Fengju thought back to the past and recalled he wasn't at all the bullying kind. But then she thought perhaps there were times when he was this way, too, he just hadn't let her see it. She gathered her thoughts and put on a stiff smile. "Your Majesty, why are you making it difficult for me?" Dong Hua tapped lightly on the teacup and slowly looked back at her. "It's the only hobby I have." Fengju didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "Your Majesty, you really..." Dong Hua placed the teacup down again. Propping his chin on his hand, he nonchalantly looked at her. "What about me?" Seeing Fengju rendered speechless, his normally indifferent eyes revealed a faintest smile. "Say, "Why did you want to save them?" he asked. In truth, she wasn't rendered speechless. It just so happened his countenance at this time was so very familiar. It was this same face which had left her a deep impression from long ago. That was why she had stood there in a daze, and before she could react, he had changed the topic. But she had heard his question clearly: why did she want to save them? She wasn't sure at first herself. It wasn't because she had cared for other people's lives, but rather because someone had told her something once. At length, she softly replied, "My late husband once told me the strong exist to protect the weak. If I do not save them, I'd be a weakling myself, then what rights would I have to protect my subjects?" Many years later, Dong Hua had not been able to forget Feng Zhu's words. He wasn't sure what her words had meant. He only knew this child had always made him feel dear, although he didn't recognize who she was. In his memory, the first time he ever saw her was by the Wangsheng shore near Qingqiu. With wet hair as dark as sea kelps, she rode the waves and came ashore. But he hadn't remembered her appearance then, in the same way he hadn't remembered how the sunflowers had looked that day. Today's incident made its way around every corner of Zhejiang. On top of that, there were several versions in circulation. In mere seconds, Dong Hua was thrown all the way from the divine deist Trinity down to 100 meters of the vulgar world. It was said at the time the Xian beast was wreaking havoc at Chengtian Terrace, Dong Hua was adding commentaries in his Buddhist scriptures. When he heard his foster sister Princess Zhihe was trapped in the fire, he at once rushed to her rescue and subdued the beast. It thus could be seen that Dong Hua treated his foster sister differently from the rest. However, another said during the Chengtian Terrace fire, Dong Hua happened to walk by and saw a heavenly maiden fighting to the death with the Xian beast. She was losing and he could no longer bear to watch, so he drew his sword to lend her a hand. Tianjun had always deemed Daijun to be a deity with neither desire nor want. It turned out there were also times when Tianjun was wrong. These stories went on and on. After Liansong caught news of this story, he came to Taichan Palace to look for Dong Hua for a round of chess and wine. At the same time, he prodded Dong Hua for confirmation. That rumor from Chengtian Terrace about a beauty fighting the beast, and you who couldn't stop yourself from helping her, I didn't really believe it. He placed a white stone down and continued, but you know, if you've finally decided that someday you'll marry a queen to do pair spiritual study with, Zhihe isn't a bad choice. Shall I help you put in a good word with my father and bring Zhihe back to heaven? Dong Hua turned his wine cup. He looked at the chessboard in contemplation and replied, "A beauty? They think she's pretty." "Pardon." Dong Hua leisurely placed a black stone down, blocking the formation of the white pieces. "They've got some good eyesight." Liansong halted. When he recovered, he closed his fan and asked in surprise, "You really saw a beauty at Chengtian Terrace?" Dong Hua kept his eyes on the chessboard. "Are you sure you came to play chess?" Liansong laughed heartily. Even Dong Hua's best friend, Lord Liansong, didn't believe these rumors. Of course everyone else on the 7th level of heaven likewise took it as a joke. They made a few guesses on Princess Zhihe's favorable future, predicting that her miserable days were finally coming to an end, and that she might soon return to heaven and perhaps even start something wonderful together with Daijun. It was said that Zhejiang had a rule where immortals had to rid of their 7 emotions and 6 desires. However, this rule only applied to those not born from fairy births. Ascension to divinity was already anomalous. There was naturally a price to pay for immortality. Donghua, however, had existed since the time yin and yang separated at the Blue Sea, a true spirit born out of heaven and earth. He wasn't bound to such a rule. For him, taking a queen was a perfectly reasonable matter. End of chapter 1.